Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Cup Roundtables. My name is Jillian Robinson. I am the General Assistant here at Cup of Hemlock. And on today's panel, we will be talking about musicals. Our working title for tonight is Do You Hear the People Sing? So we're going to be going into musicals and talking about their successes, pros and cons about this particular sector of the industry. And we have a wonderful panel with us here today. And so we're going to get started. I'm going to go around the room and we'll get to learn a little bit about our panelists before we jump in. Tonight, I will just be mediating and hosting. So all of the questions will be answered by our panelists. And these questions, the Cup of Hemlock team and myself have cobbled together. I'm looking forward to this discussion tonight, folks. So let's learn a little bit about everyone before we totally jump in. So Christoph, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Christoph. I am a music theater performer and worker in the city. I have my degree from York University, where I studied devised theater, so collective creation-based work, as well as design. And then I took all of that experience and I'm kind of diving into the world of music theater in the city. So I'm an actor and a singer. I also stage manage all over the city. And yeah, I just kind of try and keep I wear many hats and I keep my toes in many pools. It's good.
Awesome. And Christoph, we're all dying for some live theater these days for sure. So if you were to see any musical in the world ever right now, what would it be?
I think it would be the last musical that I did, which was Legally Blonde,
Nice.
because it just puts a smile on my face every time I get to watch it.
Great. And as per usual with the cup episodes, what do you have in your cup today, Christoph?
I have a cup of gin and tonic, which you can kind of see with the background appearing and disappearing. There we go.
Nice. Good choice. Amazing. So Emma, we'll go with you next. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your experience with musicals?
Yeah, hi. I'm Emma. I am a PhD student at the City University of New York Graduate Center in theater and performance. And musical theater is my both my research interest and my lifelong passion. I love musicals. I think to say I'm a fan of musicals would be an understatement. I love musicals.
Great. And if you were to see any musical right now, what would it be?
I'm obsessed with the jukebox musical Jagged Little Pill, and I've seen it before, and I was supposed to see it the weekend that Broadway shut down. So when I have my first opportunity to see a show, it'll be that one.
Nice. Good choice. Good choice. Mackenzie, we'll go with you next.
Yes. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to be on the other end of the spectrum here on these cup episodes. Normally I am in the Jill position, but today I just get to give my input on a topic, which is lovely. So yes, musicals are kind of where I got my start way back when. My first musical was Oliver. I was the late orphan, appeared in one scene, and then I sat off stage for 3 hours. And then I think that's what a lot of young artists kind of do. They get their start in musicals and they kind of branch out once they get to their post-secondary endeavors. So like Christoph there, I did go to York and also did do devised theater as well. Yeah, see? Oh, I love this. So I did that, and then I branched more into directing, and then I still have yet to direct a musical, but that is on my post-COVID list of things that I have to do. But to kind of fill that void in my life, I've been hosting a podcast all about musical theater and musicals. So that fills my days with lots of music. It's called Before the Downbeat. We'll talk more about that at the end when we do all our social plugs.
Nice.
But I will say the one musical that I would love to watch during the pandemic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, then that's easy. It's Les Mis. It's an epic story full of human resilience. The fight against all odds. It's the musical that inspired me to go into theater. And to prove my point as well, I have my official Les Mis mug that I am drinking from with my cup of Earl Grey tea. And my background is
Great.
also Les Mis. So I am full on Les Mis. And if you could see my room, there's a giant original Broadway poster of Les Mis hanging up on my wall. So Les Mis is very much front and center at all times.
Perfect. Yes, I also, before we get to you, Graham, everyone's backgrounds are lovely. The commitment is just, it's radiating. So Graham, if you want to give us an intro about yourself, musicals, et al.
Sure. So I am a sometimes actor and director. For the last few years, I've been teaching at Queen's University in the Dan School of Drama and Music. So the acting and directing career is kind of on the side. And I've done a lot of work here in Alberta, which is where I am right now, because we can teach from anywhere at this point. And so a lot of sort of jukeboxy rock and roll review type shows, which are great fun. And I returned to graduate studies doing a PhD at the University of Toronto. And like Emma, I'm studying musicals. Canadian musicals in particular are my thing that I'm studying. The show that I'd really love to see was actually a show that I had tickets for in October. I think it was October, which is Kelly versus Kelly, which is a new musical by Sarah Farb and Britta Johnson. And I've heard a couple of the songs from it at previous presentations. And I've been waiting for like 2 years to finally get to see the show up on its feet. And of course, they had to pull the plug on it. So that's just crazy disappointing. But, hopefully it returns. That would make me really happy. And then my cup is green, which was not a great choice with the green screen. So apparently my cup has, if I can figure out how to do this, Julie Andrews in it.
Oh, yes. Nice.
There she is. And vodka.
Great.
It's a vodka.
Amazing. A vodka Andrews.
Great combination.
What a way to kick us off. Okay, so let's jump in, folks. So question number 1. Do you consider musicals to be a lower art than other forms of theater? And why or why not? So Graham, do you want to kick us off with this one?
Yeah, I do. I consider musicals to be a lower art form than other forms of theater. Absolutely, 100%. And it's what I like about them. Musicals are workshopped, created, evolved in conversation with the audience. And part of that is commercial in its orientation, right? But the other part of it is it's popular. It's like where it originates in that sort of early 20th century, late 19th century soup of ordinary people in New York, and that confluence of like people from everywhere who are just trying to find ways to express themselves in this new land that they're trying to figure out where they fit in it. And musicals just kind of evolve out of that. And the thing that I really like about them is that they're unapologetic in their appeal to the emotional and to the relatability. And what I think when musicals are really great is when they somehow manage to innovate within those confines. So they innovate without alienating sometimes, which I think can be really, really fascinating and exciting. So yes, I do consider them to be a lower art form, but it's what draws me very specifically to them.
Nice. Lovely. Christoph, do you want to snowball off of that?
Yeah. I don't disagree with anything you said, Graham. However, I wouldn't consider it to be a lower form of art. And the reason I guess I question is what is to define high art versus low art, and where do we, that notion and that idea in the first place is coming from, I guess, lots of history, and what we now see as like the classical forms of art, which are viewed as the higher form of art. Well, I think you said it yourself, musicals are kind of a form of evolution coming from and stemming from what we would consider classical. Does that make them lower? I don't know if that necessarily is true. I think it makes them authentic to the time period that we're living in, and authentic to the experience in the same way that Shakespeare was in his time, and like Rembrandt is in his time, like whatever, as a visual artist, Rembrandt. But yeah, I don't know that I would consider it lower. I think it's a contemporary imagination of what art looks like now, which is equal to what it was back then. I don't know if that makes sense.
Emma?
Yeah, I was going to say something sort of along the same lines as Christoph about what really is low art and what makes art lower or higher. I also think, though, that musicals are so hard to talk about because they're so varied, in that it's both sort of a genre, but it's also sort of like an overwhelmingly large category with all sorts of genres. Like, I'm looking at Christoph's background right now, which has like a really useful list of musicals as I'm like thinking about this. But I think it's hard to talk about, The Lion King and Aladdin at the same time as you're talking about West Side Story or Sunday in the Park with George, and to place those all on the same sort of hierarchy of what is low art and high art. So I think it's a tough question.
Mackenzie, do you want to cap us off with your answer?
Sure. I mean, I will happily say that I do not consider musicals a low art, because they're deceptively versatile in what they do. Where they're kind of like a Pixar movie, where Pixar, it's often dubbed like a kids movie, but really what a Pixar movie is that it's a good movie for adults while also being able to kind of play towards a child. And that's kind of what a musical does, where it can be deceptively simple and it's kind of like, oh, like it's just appealing to the broad audience. But then for all us theater people who maybe want to go a little bit deeper into a musical, you can actually dive in. And that's exactly what Shakespeare did. Shakespeare was very good at playing for the high intellectual courts of his time, but then also he was still able to take his plays out into the mass audience and get them to watch Henry V and get them to storm the stage against the French. It's that same thing that they do, where musicals are so versatile, as Emma said, where even though like you may have the genre of dramatic musicals, well, a Les Mis is very different from a Phantom, and yet they all have their own unique voice. And I think that's something really special about musicals, which is different from a play, where I think plays, to a general audience, I don't know if they could always identify identify different artists within that different era. Like, if I went up to a general public and read them a monologue from Marlowe and a monologue from Shakespeare, I don't know if they would be able to tell the difference. But if you play them something from Phantom and something from Les Mis, they sound so different from each other that audiences can automatically identify them and then also attach themselves to different styles. Like, I guarantee Emma's preference in musical may be different from Graham's, which may be different from Christoph's, which may be different from you, Jill. Like, I know, Jill, you and I always argue about Rent. You love that musical. I really don't like that musical. I was going to use another word, but I'm not. But that's that thing about musicals is that they're so versatile and they cover so much. Like, really, musicals is more of an umbrella term almost, because there's so much going on underneath that umbrella, makeup, all the wire work that creates a musical. So yeah, I would definitely say musicals are hard just because of how deceptively versatile they can really be. Like they can masquerade as a general populist piece, but then you can really dive in deep, and we're going to do that when we get into more of these questions for sure. Which is kind of like we're kind of going to lift the hood of this car of musicals and see what the inner workings are, and that's what I like about musicals. Like, a Sondheim musical can be really simple. Like, a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. It's a really simple comedy on the outside, but when we actually dig in and realize how much interworking they did with all the ancient Roman plays and the whole concept of slavery and that type of thing, you can really kind of dive deeper into that musical if you choose to. But sometimes people go to Stratford, they see a funny happening on the way to the Forum with Bruce Dow, they laugh, have a good night, and then they go home. Like, that's what's nice about a musical, is that it appeals to both the intellectual as well as just my dad who likes to pay, who just likes to go out and see a good show and hear some good music. So I definitely would say musicals, to me, are a high art, because that's a tightrope to walk that not everybody can do.
Right. So let's dig into more of these questions and let's lift the lid of this car, which is giving me Grease Lightning vibes for sure. That's going to be my corny segue to question number 2. So although musicals are considered by some to be lower art, how do we account for their commercial and financial success? Emma, do you want to start us off with this one?
Yeah. I mean, I think musicals feel more accessible to a wider audience that might be intimidated by going to the theater. And I mean, like for me personally, I love theater and I love plays. I have a really short attention span and I'm not very good at sitting in a chair for 2 hours, and all of that makes me very antsy. But I find that when you go to a musical, the fact that there is every 4 or 5 or 10 minutes you're going to get to watch like a musical number is it's so much easier, I find, on your mind. Like it's an easier watching experience, even if the content of the show itself is not easier or is far more complicated. It's really easy on your sort of attention span. And I think that they're very marketable because they have song in them, which makes, I think, it easier to, like, I think a show like Hamilton or Dear Evan Hansen can become really popular because you can sort of know the songs and you can sell people on the songs, and the songs can become well known on their own, which you obviously don't have that in a play. You kind of have to see the play in its entirety live to have an idea of what goes on in that play, versus with songs you can sort of get a taste of it before you go to it.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. Mac, do you want to kick off your answer for this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the reason for the musical success, both commercially and financially, is because they're the perfect mix, especially a mega musical, like a big Broadway or West End musical, but even like a regional community theater production. There's a mix of both spectacle and universality that mix well together, that create that inviting experience for the audience. Because I mean, you're totally right. Like if my dad's got a choice between paying money to go see Death of a Salesman or Les Miserables, my dad would not be overly interested in sitting for 3 hours in a dark theater watching this family tragedy unfold. Now, he could if I really pushed him on it, but if he's given the choice of where do I put my money, I'm going to go to something that is going to appeal to me, it's going to give me a bang for my buck. Like musicals are also kind of like a Marvel movie in this situation, where Marvel movies, they're the big blockbuster, right? Everybody's going to go see the big blockbuster popcorn flick. And sometimes you get a fluff piece. That's like Ant-Man, the first Ant-Man movie. That was kind of like, it's okay. Like, it was there. Like, it's not an awful movie. It's still a pretty good movie, but like compared to other ones, it's okay. It filled my popcorn fix. But then you get other ones that are like these, that just go above and beyond that next level. That's like a Black Panther or the Avengers Infinity War Endgame's big finale pieces that just go pushing that much further and give you that much more that you can kind of dive into, and that's what's so appealing to about a musical, is you can go see something fluffy and fun like the Addams Family musical or The Producers. That's just kind of there. It's a good time. You don't have to go in deep intellectual. But then you can go see a Sondheim show like Sunday in the Park with George. Well, now you're going to get into some more intellectual sides of things here, and you're going to get a little bit more stimulation from that. And I think that's what audiences love about that is that, once again, musicals appeal to that wide spectrum of people who are really interested in diving in and having a cocktail afterwards. And Jill, you and I have done this many a times, sitting and analyzing a musical to its like nth degree. And then you got people like my dad who will go and see a good show and then they drive home. And it's like, nope, that was good. Like if I like the music, I'll listen to it. And I'll get more familiar with the songs, and maybe I'll take somebody back to go see it again, because once again it's that universality of, hey, I can take somebody to go see Black Panther because it's really accessible and fun, and yet there's also something in there for people who are looking for that. Les Mis, great show, great music, but then you also can dive in a little bit deeper if you want to get into a little bit more of what's going on in that. So yeah, I think that's why musicals are. They're that spectacle and universality that mix well together to create that experience that makes everybody just want to come out and see them.
Right. And Graham, how about you? How do we account for the commercial financial success of musicals, in your opinion?
Well, I guess, I mean, I kind of can go back to that word about a lower art form. I think the reason I embrace that is because I don't necessarily think of it as a pejorative. And I think in a world of like theater studies or academic studies, for a long time it was. And now that we've sort of started theorizing about like affect theory or emotion or how we communicate with audiences through feeling and emotion and embodied experience in addition to just the intellectual, it's opening up a more nuanced understanding of that. So I embrace the lowerness of it because of its ambitions towards universality, towards spectacle, towards sentiment, towards emotion, right? It's a music theater form, which like emotionally European derived theater is kind of one of the few traditions that separates those out. We have this term musical theater, whereas in a lot of other cultures around the world, theater just implies music and theater, but that's beside the point. Those things are all kind of what make it potentially commercially and financially successful, because there's multiple modalities of connection with a show, right? They're not all linguistic. They're not all intellectual. They're not all thematic. They're not all even based on identifying with the characters. You can do Fiddler on the Roof in Thailand because there is the music that can be an entry point for some people. And then that sort of overtly theatrical style of it universalizes. It turns it into a parable or a fable that people can then connect that sort of experience of like a parent having to shift traditions to accommodate the daughters that he loves. So you get all those positives, I think, by thinking of it as lower art and its appeal. And then you also get like Christoph mentioned, musicals are very much of their moment because they have to appeal. And that means that they are incredibly white, that they tend to be a little middle class. They tend to be, a lot of them, as we're noticing, don't actually transfer very well to 40 years later. I don't know if I'd want to be doing The King and I or Annie, Get Your Gun right now. Right? So I think that lower art thing is about appealing to the audience, about accessibility, all these words we've heard: accessibility, universality, sentiment, multiple ways for audiences to get into a show so that Mackenzie can get in one way and his dad can get in a different way. Those are so many of the positives that I celebrate. Yeah. The lowerness of it, the bold lowerness of it, as opposed to the avant-garde, the court theater. There are also some of the red flags that make it such an interesting form to dive into.
Christoph, how about you? Your thoughts with question number 2?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things have already been obviously touched upon. I think, we had talked earlier about the term musical kind of being a little bit of an umbrella term, and I think, kind of looking at it that way, musicals, like, it's storytelling with song and dance, kind of in a nutshell. And obviously there's a lot, you can dissect that a lot more, but because it will use whatever music of the time or of the period or of that is of the writers, and there's a versatility to and a freedom that we've kind of given ourselves with musicals that is separate from what we would call, I guess, higher art, from opera, which kind of has a very particular style and genre that it lives within. Musicals, I mean, we have our golden age pieces, we have our jukebox musicals that take pop songs and things that have been written by other people, and so you're able to, because it's so varied, and we kind of have given the freedom within the term musical, like in its definition, I think that opens up such a door to be able to reach literally everybody. And music is such a universal language in its way to reach people, and everyone will have a different preference in music, but in the same way, there's a musical written in every genre of music that kind of accompanies it, and a musical that tells every story that you can think of as well, right? We've given such a freedom for writers in the contemporary music theater world to kind of go for it and try and see what happens. And then you get things like a Hamilton, which reached like mass public appeal in a way that we've never seen before, because we just given Lin-Manuel Miranda like the right to try, and him and every other writer in the world, right? And so I think that's ultimately like a huge part of why of the commercial and financial success.
Yeah. Lovely. And this segues beautifully into question number 3, because we've kind of already touched on the content of this question, but now we'll be able to kind of just hone in a little bit more. So question number 3 is, do musicals only connect to audiences on an emotional level, or can they connect on an intellectual level as well? And then the second part of this question, do you feel that one style of musical, so the American musical, for example, Broadway, or the British musical, for example, ones that originated in the West End, is better at connecting to audiences on multiple levels than the other? So first tackling, can they access audiences on an emotional level and or on an intellectual level? And then, in your opinion, do you think the American musical versus the British musical, or vice versa, does a better way of accessing those points? So it's a bit of a beefier question. And Graham, do you wanna start us with this one?
Sure. I mean, I think everybody's already kind of given really convincing arguments embedded in all their other answers that they connect on both levels, often very effectively. And, that's going to change, obviously, depending on the cultural and historical context of your audiences and where they do or do not link with a show and what they bring into the room, and even a willingness to connect. Musicals, I find, actually kind of require a willingness to connect emotionally and intellectually kind of more than a lot of other contemporary popular art forms right now. Like, there are people who just hate musicals. And sometimes I think it's the singing and talking thing, but I don't know, people are good enough at theatricality to handle that. I think it's more the unabashed emotionality of them sometimes. There's a really interesting theory. There's a scholar named David Saverin. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he writes about how like highbrow and lowbrow as categories were used by scholars and sort of elite arts type people as a social stratification strategy, right? I mean, kind of the cerulean dress speech from Devil Wears Prada kind of explains how fashion does the same thing, right? Do you know if it's blue or cerulean? That's kind of highbrow, lowbrow. And what Saverin talks about is he kind of calls musicals middlebrow, which is this not only kind of something where he places them in between high and low, but he also argues for a position where musicals kind of actively subvert that ability to build that hierarchy and those divisions. And one of the things that really happens in the middlebrow is that soup of the emotional and the intellectual. Right? So the highbrow is intellectual and refined and civilized and cold and Victorian in a lot of ways. And then the lowbrow is like the mobs and the emotion and the masses, and sort of nightmare version of that is like a Trump rally. Right? And you don't want those to infect each other. I mean, even the ancient Romans were terrified of that. Some of the philosophers. So this middlebrow thing is really great. And then in terms of the American musical and the British musical, I mean, I don't know. It's hard to tell because even those change. Like, is the British musical the Andrew Lloyd Webber mega musicals in the 80s, or is it music hall or pantos, or is it now like everybody's talking about Jamie, right? Which is or Juliet, which are both very like, or Six. Is it Six? About the wives of Henry? Yeah. So interesting, right? And very different. Yeah, I wonder, I mean, maybe some other people can comment on this. I wonder if the economic pressures of running a show in a Broadway theater versus running a show in a West End theater, they're very different. Like, the investment required in a West End theater is a lot lower and there's more collective ownership. Maybe that allows for what we're seeing right now, which seems to be a combination of revivals from New York to sell tickets, but homegrown shows that are weirdly a little more formally experimental. Although there are some good formal experiments happening in the US too, as maybe Broadway musicals that are unknown quantities that aren't recognized intellectual property or revivals aren't selling as well. So they're having to find other ways, immersive experiences or things like that to get that attention. So I really don't know about the question between the American and the British musicals for connecting with audiences.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up. The economic differences for sure are present with both. Mackenzie, do you want to build off that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Graham's totally right that the whole intellectual connecting on both levels, it totally depends on the musical itself. Like it's one of those things where depends on the show, really depends on how it is. I mean, musicals in general, because the songs always come at a heightened emotional moment of the story, because that's the way musicals work. Is you build to a point where you can no longer speak and you have to sing. Ergo, Fantine sings when she's at a really high emotional point, and we're all going to connect with her on that point because, hey, I may not have done what she's done, but I've been in that place looking down at the world going, my dream is dead. Like, there's that emotion, or like On My Own, the unrequited love, right? It's that thing of musicals can always connect with you emotionally because we all have emotions and we all connect and can in some way connect with the story in some way. It's then dependent on, I think, the writing and the book and the lyrics, as well as the music sometimes. Like if you're familiar enough with music and sheet music and can read music, right? It's a lot more times the lyrics and the book that surround the music that then, if it's written really well, like a Sondheim, that then you can get into a much more intellectual, or Lin-Manuel Miranda and his Hamilton stuff, right? Like the more you analyze the lyrics, the more you get out of them, and that once again is dependent on the audience member who is wanting to go that distance. So I think once again it's just dependent on the audience and on the show itself. If the show provides that intellectual stimulus, then obviously it's there and audiences will pick up on it. But sometimes it's just nice, fun theater, and that's you're just going to connect to emotionally, and that is a-okay. Mamma Mia is still a fun musical, even though I would struggle to find really deep intellectual conversations to come out of that. Mind you, I'm sure somebody's written an essay on it, but like emotionally, you connect to the mother-daughter story, right? That is what you're connecting to in that story, and that is a-okay. In regards to which is better at doing the tightrope walk, once again, I have to agree with Graham that I think it's dependent on which era you're looking at in musical theater. I mean, 70s and 80s, that was Sondheim's heyday, and he was the king of doing the tightrope walk. Then you get to now where it's kind of shifting the other way a little bit, because Graham, you're right. Like British theaters, they're much better at doing that. Less dependent on the money, more dependent on the arts and the writing, that they have that ability to kind of go that way. So it flips back and forth. I think for me personally, musical wise, I think I'm more familiar with some of these people, with some of these composer teams and musicals that are on the American side of the walking the tightrope, whether it's a Sondheim or I would even argue a Rodgers and Hammerstein, because if you actually get into what they wrote, like Oklahoma is once again deceptively simple, but yet what they're talking about is something incredibly complex. Even Bach and Harnick, who wrote Fiddler on the Roof, what that musical is really talking about, incredible. But once again, it can be deceptively simple. I'm just connecting to Tevye and his thing of, do I accept my daughter and her Taylor boyfriend or don't I? But you can get into a whole lot more in that. So once again, I think it depends on which era of musicals you're looking at. I think the Americans, though, because the style of music, like the American, it's called the American musical, and the British kind of had the music halls and pantomimes. The Rodgers and Hammerstein kind of then infected the British to the point where when the British were trying to do their big musical, which was Oliver, they actually tried hiring American directors because they were like, well, the only way we can ever make an American musical that's going to rival Rodgers and Hammerstein is to hire an American director. Turns out they didn't need to do that, but that's what they thought they had to do because it was trying to capture that. So I do think the American style has a little bit of an edge to it, just because they've had a few more years, and then the British kind of caught up to them and then surpassed them, and they've kind of flip-flopped back and forth since then. But I think that the Americans have a little bit of an edge just because Showboat was the first, it was American, and then this art form's kind of developed from there. So Well, overall, it flip-flops. It depends on what era and what genre you're looking at. And yeah.
Great. And now to the man with the array of musicals behind him, both American and from the British side, Christoph. If you'd like to answer question number 3, what are your thoughts?
Lots of shows I could talk about in here. But yeah, I think that, yes, musicals connect, I think we've all said it, emotionally and intellectually. And I think every show will do so at different kind of levels of each. And some shows are purely entertainment, and like that's okay. And some shows are like very much like are meant and written to have you walk out of the room having like whatever, questioning things, or having thoughts and discussions, etc. And I think a really good musical is able to kind of find the combination of the two, and able to like reach you intellectually if you're willing to, and is able to like make you think through different things, and is also able to like make you feel certain whatever emotions, whether it just be joy and like lightheartedness, or like make you just like again think through the world that you're living in the time that you are, or even like look back on other time periods. I think a good musical will find both, but there are some that exist that kind of lean one way or another, and I think they all kind of serve a purpose within the canon that we have. Whether the American or the British do it better, it's a big question, a hard one. I think nowadays, and I think Graham touched on it, the British are becoming more adventurous and experimental in what they produce in a large scale commercial way. So on the West End versus on Broadway, I think the West End is putting out some more avant-garde, some more like veering away from what we're seeing as the traditional or whatever the contemporary musical. But I think that outside of that like big blockbuster musical world, I don't know. I think the Americans, there's so much stuff on the that we're not talking about, that we're not seeing on Broadway, that is also like bringing different styles of theater, looking at like fringe festivals like that, where these like more like niche markets and smaller productions and places where people feel free to experiment. They don't necessarily make it to the big Broadway like stages, but are incredibly valid and like emotional, and like I don't know, they make you think in different ways, and they push the boundaries of what we consider musicals, but they don't ever hit the big stages. So I think in the UK right now, at least, they're doing a better job at doing so in a big commercial way, whereas I think in New York they're playing it relatively safe in terms of what they're putting on Broadway proper, but outside of the Broadway, off the Broadway stages, in the smaller theaters, I think there's a lot of really interesting innovation that's also happening. So I think that New York and the States just have a harder time justifying putting it on the bigger stages, which I think is a shame sometimes.
Right, yeah. And I'd imagine post-pandemic too, like we are all kind of in an interregnum right now, at a bit of a standstill. And I think definitely the reputation and coding of what musicals are, both across the pond and here, will evolve too. So Emma, your thoughts on this, presently what we know of what musicals are before they possibly shift.
Like everyone has essentially said, I think the best musicals are the ones that are operating on an emotional and an intellectual level. And I think when I think of something like Hamilton, which, when the cast album first came out, I remember everyone was obsessed with like decoding every single lyric in Hamilton, because you can think about Hamilton for days. Like there's so much to find in there. But you also go see Hamilton and you cry. And I think that if Hamilton was just this really incredible piece of writing, but it wasn't this emotionally kind of gutting experience, it wouldn't have that same appeal to a sort of non-musical theater audience, or to a wider audience. But what I think is really interesting is like, which one do you care about more? Because I feel like for me, at the end of the day, I'd rather see a musical that speaks to me emotionally, that makes me feel something, that maybe isn't like a groundbreaking piece of writing than see something that is so incredibly interesting in the writing, but doesn't really make, like, none of the characters really appeal to me, and I don't really feel for anyone, because I think that can be a very long night at the theater if you don't really emotionally connect to the material. And I think I mentioned before, like, I'm obsessed with Jagged Little Pill, and I don't think Jagged Little Pill is a very good show. I don't think the book is very good. I think some of it's kind of awkwardly written, but when I saw it, I connected with the characters and I connected with the story, and because of that, I still was like, I want to see this again, even if I felt like it had flaws. Yeah, and then again, in terms of the American-British question, I also think it's such a tough divide because relationship between both those musical theater scenes is so close. I'm taking a class this semester with David Saverin, and the class is called, like, the American Musical, essentially. And for the first several weeks of the course, I remember thinking, oh, it's really interesting that we're not doing any Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals at all. And it took me several weeks to remember, like, oh, he's not American. That's the simple reason why he's not on the syllabus. But to me, when I think musical theater, when I think American musical theater, Andrew Lloyd Webber is a major part of what is American musical theater, even if he's not American. So yeah, I think that there's such a close relationship, and things transfer so quickly. Like you mentioned Six, and Six was already making its Broadway debut, was about to open on Broadway. There's this determination that if something is good in one country, we have to bring it to the other one. We have to make it work in the other one too. Not everything comes, but that's sort of the goal in some ways.
Right. And again, like I said, like, maybe we will see more of a bridge of that happening, right? More of the melding of brains, or maybe it'll be different. Like, different countries will be experimenting and different calls to action post pandemic, for sure. So we've talked a lot about how and anyone who has seen a musical or is interested in musicals, it really is a cacophony of emotion, of movement, of song, dance, intense moments, fluttery, soft moments. And every musical is colored so differently, and is rooted so differently in content and culture, etc. So question number 4 is a bit of a broader question, but so this is question number 4. If you had to choose one musical to be representative of the form's artistic potential, which would it be and why? And obviously this probably will change your answer throughout your lives, but I guess right now, which one musical would be representative of the form's artistic potential? And Emma, I'm going to come back to you for this one. I'm going to have you start this one off for us.
It's interesting because I think I was thinking about this question earlier and coming up with answers, but I think I've changed my answer through talking this out. This might be I think I would go with Hamilton because, like I said, I think it, to me, really represents the sort of perfect melding of intellectualism and beautiful storytelling, and it's also extremely accessible. It does both those things without throwing away what you were talking about, Graham, all these things that make musicals so great for, like, a wide audience. I think that is it does everything very well in terms of all those things. And I also think it's an interesting example of, again, what we think of as pop culture, what we think of as high art, low art, because, when they used to talk about Hamilton, like, oh, it's a rap musical about the founding fathers, like, that in and of itself sounds kind of maybe a little avant-garde, maybe a little out of the box. It sounds a little bit crazy. And then it became something that is so widely popular that then puts it into this category of pop culture, where I think it, in a world where this wasn't a massively popular musical, it would almost be seen as more intellectual. I think the fact that it became so popular leads it to be seen perhaps as less intellectual. all this to say, yeah, my answer is Hamilton.
Nice. Well put. Graham, what would be the one musical right now that you think is most representative of the art form's potential?
The obvious answer, is Hamilton, right? So I'm not going to stay on that one. I'll pick something else. But just flagging that Hamilton is a really rare thing to come along in the history of musicals. Like, it's equivalent to like a Showboat, Oklahoma, Cabaret, Les Mis, as those like paradigm shifting shows that are going to inspire imitators for the next 30 years, many of them good and many of them really terrible. But there's a show that I'll just put on people's radars that I think is weirdly representative of the form's artistic potential, because it doesn't innovate with the form, it embraces the form, which is a musical called Children of God by Corey Payette, which is about residential schools. And a family of young Indigenous people kind of pulled apart, OG Cree characters who are sort of pulled apart by the residential school system, and then kind of explores the aftermath of that. And dramaturgically, it actually leans in and kind of embraces the book musical dramaturgy. And what it does by embracing that kind of popular American musical leanings is it sort of distances you from the gritty realism and the horror of the gritty realism. I'm actually working on a paper on this, so that's kind of why it's in my mind right now. But then it allows you that bit of distance so that the story can be told, but then kind of sideswipes you with the emotional connections that musicals provide, which is kind of like a sentimental, sympathetic, emotional connection that's not as traumatizing. But I don't know, did any of you see that show? Yeah,
I have
so
not.
I can attest to this.
Sounds really interesting, though.
Children of God, you said it was, right?
Yeah. The first tour was like a co-pro between, I think, the Arts Club and National Arts Center. The ending finishes. They finish kind of the closing number, and then at that time, the actress, who's since passed on, her name's Kathy Elliott, also a musical writer on her own. She starts singing. Yeah, she starts singing at the end and just chanting almost with the drum, and it begins that way. And by the time that sequence is done, they've moved to the edges of the stage. It's the band comes forward, and it's just a lineup of the entire cast and band singing. They move down the stairs a little bit, and they just hold out their hands. And by the time we were done, the entire National Arts Center was holding hands in a giant circle across the aisles.
Wow.
Yeah, and it just becomes it really does lean into the idea of sort of musicals and emotion, but also Indigenous ideas about storytelling and medicine, and sort of an exposing of the poison before it can be expunged. So it doesn't leave you feeling in the way that some musicals do, like everything's okay, it's a happy ending. It doesn't leave you there, but it does leave you kind of standing around in a circle holding hands, going, okay, now we got to do something.
Yep.
So it's so interesting, that show, because it leans into the simplicity of musical theater and kind of wields it as the feature, not the bug. Musicals, the thing that musicals get dismissed for, instead it leans into.
Right.
Yeah, it's a pretty marvelous experience.
I think also it takes the music. I saw it several times. I was working at the Siegel Center when we did it there, so I saw it I think like 4 or 5 times. And it also takes the music so literally there at the end, because this chant that you're joining in on is this chant that is going to allow her to finally like cross over into the afterlife and finally be able to rest. And so it quite literally asks you, the audience, to start singing along as part of the plot. And I think that was like, I've literally never experienced that in another musical ever. And I think that's such a powerful use of music in musical theater that, it's a great musical.
It really puts a modern swing on what it means to break the fourth wall, I think, definitely. And reaching out, and how these pieces can reach out on so many different levels and actually connect with so many different folks too, for sure. Mackenzie, if you had one musical right now that is representative of the artistic potential, what would it be for you?
I'll have to say Rent. No, just kidding.
Can't even defend myself, Mac. I'm supposed to stay neutral.
I know, it's so great. I can just keep ribbing you on this. No, one that I will say I think is representative of the form's artistic potential is the Book of Mormon. This musical has grown on me the more and more times I've seen it, because one of the things I think musicals can sometimes struggle with, because as I think Christoph, you said, like, musicals, rightly so, are very much set in a very particular time. They address a particular moment, but yet sometimes they don't get to those bigger questions that sometimes these great intellectual plays that we have throughout history have, like the Greeks and Romans getting into all their great philosophical bigger discussions. And I think Book of Mormon deceptively gets to those topics. Like, at first you're thinking, oh, it's just a funny story about Mormons going off to Africa. And we got these funny songs that are like I'm not going to swear. Screw you, God. Like, you have that one big song in there too. And you're talking about Death Stars and hobbits and maggots and who knows where. Like, it's just, you think it's just funny. Like it's just really, really funny. But then when it gets into those, when you think about it, it's talking about the bigger things, like what the musical is saying about organized religion, the whole white savior complex, or the way the Western religions have kind of just been doing this for centuries, of going into these places and being like, we will bring you the word of God, and like these bigger topics that are really kind of interesting and really challenge you, like being brought up Catholic and also United in my family, like going to church once a week for catechism and things like that. And then going away going, okay, that actually like made me question some bigger things about religion and things like that. Some of those bigger topics that sometimes can kind of be harder to get to in a musical because it's such a grounded, in the moment, high emotional moment of a certain particular time and place, that it's difficult to get to that next high topic level. And I think what's great about Book of Mormon is that it gets you there, but you don't even realize you're getting there until you sit back and go, wait a minute, what just happened? And it's the reason why, like, when it's come to Toronto, I've gone back and seen it a few times, because I just had to go back and see it. Go get the cheap seats and just go sit. Because it just stimulated me in so many more ways than I ever thought it would. And I think if more musicals can get up to that high big question level, I think there's some really interesting things we can get to in there. And musicals are definitely working up to that level. I just think Book of Mormon hit that level, and people didn't realize it got to that level. And I think that's wonderfully, deceptively smart. And it's a bigger thing that we could do.
Yeah, it's amazing what art forms have done, like satire and the idea of like modern satire, what that means and how to play upon it. And it definitely cuts deeper nowadays than it has arguably in the past too, for sure. Christoph, what's your choice for a musical that is representative of the art form for you presently?
Yes. I kind of went a different direction with this question when I was thinking about it, and I was less thinking about kind of current musicals, and I kind of thought about it. I don't know if it was in a bigger sense or not, but I thought to myself, like, what makes up a musical? And to me, it's like, it's storytelling. Ultimately, we're telling a story to an audience, and the musicals, we talk about the triple threat. We talk about the trifecta: the singing, the dancing, and the acting. And so I thought to myself, what show kind of use all three of those things really effectively to tell a story? And I thought about Oklahoma. And I don't think that Oklahoma is like the most current or the epitome of the musical, but in terms of like what it, like the potential and the way that it uses the art form, I think Oklahoma as a show like does that really well. It uses like verbal, like whatever, the book storytelling, as well as the song and like the movement and the dance, to all together effectively tell a really compelling story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's place for a good old dance break that just like is super entertaining and a big tap number. But I think when it, like, in terms of the potential, like if I want to dig down to, like, ultimately we're trying to tell a story, I think Oklahoma uses all three of those things and tells together and cohesively a really compelling story.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for that reason, it was like, that was my thought, was it represents the potential and what it could be. I think that can also be interpreted in a more contemporary way, but that was the show that came to my mind as like, that's an example of what the potential could look like in the 21st century. And now it's like, how do we interpret that and accommodate to a 21st century audience?
Great. It's amazing. Like, we've had 4 different responses to this question. And again, it just speaks to how the genre is, like we've talked about, so varied. And like, for instance, Christoph took the more practical, what the art form is, and some of us took the more like thematic, what the art form is, or an emotional foundation, what the art form is. And I think that is a beautiful, musicals do offer that sort of blossoming, open forum to discuss about, as we're doing tonight. So wonderful. I love that we had so many different pieces brought to the forefront on that one. So now we're going to get more into folks writing these masterpieces and blessing our stages throughout the times. With question number 5, is there a musical composition team that you feel is equivalent to or the same level as some of the greatest Western playwrights? So, example, Shakespeare, you could say Chekhov, Ibsen, those theater makers, playwrights that are rooted in our theater studies, in our play canons. What sort of musical composition teams do you think hit the same gravitas? Mackenzie, I'll have you start us off with this one.
Sure. I mean, this was actually the easiest question to answer out of this entire list of questions. And for me, the only answer I can really give that's up there is Stephen Sondheim. That man, like, I can't say enough good things about him, but his canon of work spanning from 1957 with West Side Story all the way up into Extending the Park with George and Bounce and The Frogs. Like, it's just so vast and so multicolored and varied that no one piece is ever the same as the other. Like, if you played A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, A Little Night Music, and Pacific Overtures. Yes. So if you played all those for people and didn't tell them who composed it, you would think they're different people because they're all just sounding so different. And yet it all came from this one man whose teacher was Christoph. Going off what your last answer was, Oscar Hammerstein, who helped write Oklahoma, was his teacher, and he learned how to write character. And that's what some of these great playwrights like Shakespeare figured out was. You can copy some basic plots, like Titus Andronicus. It's not an original plot, but and neither is Sweeney Todd. But you take some of those plot elements, and yet you add some really great complex characters that you can really sink your teeth into, and that's why Sondheim is often called like the performer's writer, because he gives, as a performer, so much for you, both lyrically as well as just in the music itself, to dive into. Like, I would easily put Sweeney Todd as a character up there with Macbeth. Like they're both just so complex, and they're not just one-dimensional evil guys killing off their enemies. There's so much more going on there. Like, that song Epiphany is just as good as the Tomorrow and Tomorrow speech that Macbeth gives at the end of the play. There's just so much going on there, and I have my Sondheim books in my cupboard behind me that I pour over continually because of my podcast, and we talk about Sondheim on there. But he just gives so much. Not I guess music may not always be the most hummable, but on a level where the writing is so strong, Sondheim. By a landslide. The fact that Lin-Manuel Miranda has openly admitted that he copied a lot of Sondheim stuff when he was doing Hamilton shows you just how influential Sondheim has become, where people now, whether it's Jason Robert Brown or Lin-Manuel Miranda, who are following in his footsteps and trying to copy. Like his whole opening to Hamilton is his homage to the opening of Sweeney Todd. Like there's just so much in there, and Sondheim just paved the way, and his writing is so strong that I couldn't think of anybody else who's ever gotten up to that level. There's been a lot of people who come close, but Stephen Sondheim is the one that I would easily put in like an anthology book. So just read the script and the text, and you'll get something out of it. There's so much going on in that yeah, definitely
Nice.
Sondheim.
Great. Graham, how about you? What musical composition team do you feel is the equivalent to the higher ups in the playwright theater world?
Well, like Sondheim's the obvious answer, but and it is as you play it as an actor, you really sort of learn how really good he is at what he does. But I'm gonna spin it a little bit actually, and just kind of flag that musicals, because they're sort of created on the floor and in the room with a bunch of people working together sometimes. It's not somebody who would end up in a list of playwrights, but I think has made contribution to so many of the best pieces that will survive forever, which is Jerome Robbins or Bob Fosse. I'd include both of them, right? As choreographer, directors who shaped the storytelling, right? It's Jerome Robbins who really pushed hard in Fiddler on the Roof towards embracing the thematics about leaving, like the pogroms and leaving the shtetl and all that kind of thing. And then the way he innovated with movement and character and story. And Fosse's the same thing. I mean, you just would not have Chicago without Bob Fosse. Just what's on the page isn't there. So I would say, Robbins and Fosse as great writers who don't actually have their work published. But that's, again, one of the great things about the form. That is just so much to love about it.
Yeah. So many things to spotlight, even when they aren't given the spotlight, for sure. Emma, how about you? What team fits your fancy as being top dog?
I mean, yeah, again, like Sondheim is, the answer to the question, but I was also thinking a lot about which pieces I've seen, like in recent years, that I thought of as very intellectually interesting pieces or very innovative pieces. And I was thinking about Fun Home, which I loved. And Fun Home is Janine Tesori. And then I was thinking about how Janine Tesori also wrote Shrek the Musical. And I think that that's such a fun thing about musical theater, is that you take someone like Tesori, and who can write these incredible intellectual pieces, and also write, not that there's anything wrong with that, but also write Shrek the Musical, which is just fun. And I think that, again, goes back to what you were saying earlier, Graham, about like that is the sort of power of musical theater, is that it doesn't have to be high art. And then I also was going to go a similar route to you, Graham, and talk about, again, I was thinking about pieces from the past few years, and I was thinking about Hadestown, and I was thinking about Great Comet, and I was thinking both of those, are incredibly well written pieces, and the writing is excellent. But it's also the direction. It's the, Rachel Chavkin and this innovative staging that made those pieces so incredible and so new. So I think, again, like musical theater is such a collaborative art form, and those aspects were sort of inseparable from why the piece felt so fresh and so innovative.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And Christoph, to cap off this question, what musical composition team is your choice?
I'm going to be the outlier and not start off my statement with Sondheim as the obvious answer, which that's okay.
It's okay.
I say to like reassure myself, because everybody else in the room has stated this as fact, so it's fine. When I was thinking about the question, I maybe I'm a sucker for the golden age and that could just be me, but Rodgers and Hammerstein was like, again, was my answer. And I think that, I mean, what we know as the contemporary musical, like Oklahoma was like the big shifting point that kind of transitioned into what we are and what we have now, obviously with more transitions through time. But when I look at their ability to tell a story, their with the music, and like to make you feel like, I don't feel things in musicals the same way that I do when I listen to an R&H show or I watch a show. Like their ability to pull you into a story and keep you there and take you on this incredible journey, with the music as well as with their book and with their storytelling. I think they are unmatched in their ability to do so. And they're like, and they started what we now have. And they, like you said, Oscar Hammerstein was Stephen Sondheim's like mentor and teacher. And from there, he continued to, yes, evolve. But I think looking at like, in the same way like Shakespeare and Ibsen and those playwrights that we talk about were the beginnings of what we have now, and are the people that we look back to. Rodgers and Hammerstein in the musical form, for me, are those people, and is that duo. I look back and I say, what they do is unmatched, and is what we have now is different, but you go back there and I get drawn back into their music and into their storytelling every time.
Great. And that is a wonderful segue to sort of take all these big names. We've talked about the American musicals. We've talked about British musicals, and now we're gonna root things a little bit closer to home and kick off our final question of tonight's panel. Has to do with Canadian musicals. So, question number 6. Why have such a small selection of Canadian musicals, so such as Come From Away, Drowsy Chaperone, and Anne of Green Gables, been able to compete with the larger North American or British musical theater establishments? And the second part to this question, do Canadian musicals have their own distinct voice from the American and British musicals? So again, bit of a beefier question, so feel free to answer them together or apart. And Christoph, I'm going to come back at you with this one. I'm going to have you kick us off with our final question.
Sure. Why have they not been able to compete in the larger North American context, or larger, I guess, musical context? I think the Canadian musical theater scene, although internally is extensive, and there's all kinds of new things and innovative things that are being written, I don't know that the community is as connected externally. There aren't as many eyes on what we're doing here, ultimately. And so you have the odd outliers that come from a ways, and the Anne of Green Gables and the Drowsy Chaperones, as you mentioned, that yes, something will pique somebody's interest and off they go, but otherwise eyes aren't normally on us and on what we're doing, in most of the cases. And so what we're doing kind of is kept within our borders. Not to say that it's not as good. In fact, I have like some of my favorite musicals are Canadian musicals, and I think that there's like some excellent work that's being done, some really cool, innovative storytelling that's being done nowadays with the contemporary Canadian musical. But yeah, I think that eyes just aren't on the community and aren't on like what we are able to do. And I think in recent years, there's been a little bit more branching out, and but it's Canadians kind of making their way and going into the American scene particularly, and kind of putting their work out there in a more forward way that will then hopefully get some more eyes to see what we're able to do. I think in really like Come From Away in the last number of years, that has brought a little bit more attention as well. But prior to that, there just isn't attention on our community, which is a little bit of shame in my opinion. But I think that's ultimately why we haven't gone out that far. And do we have our own voice? Yeah, I think we do. I think we're very influenced by the Broadway musicals and the West End musicals, because that's, in terms of like, that's what we see, I guess, the most, and ultimately then what you see and what you're bombarded with and what is popular does affect, but do we have our own voice? Yeah, I think we do. I think we have our own way of telling stories and our own Canadian. We're telling Canadian stories. A lot of Canadian musicals are telling stories that are relevant to our place and our time as well, going back to what we were talking about earlier. And I think in that way, inherently, we have our own voice that we then carry through what we do. So yeah, I don't know. Those are my thoughts.
Right. And Emma, let's hear your voice on this question.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about what makes a musical fully Canadian. Because there are obviously Canadian musicals, but there's also musicals like Ragtime or Parade, which premiered in Canada as a sort of stop on their, eventual goal of New York. Or there's things like, like Jagged Little Pill, which is a jukebox musical from a Canadian album by a Canadian songwriter, but the entire show was developed by sort of American writers in the States. And then when I think, because to me, I think one thing that makes a musical very Canadian is if the content is Canadian. And I think a lot of Canadian musicals that come to mind have plot lines that are explicitly about Canada, especially like Come From Away, which has also been an interesting thing because an example I've talked about before is there's a musical version of The Apprenticeship of Diddy Kravitz by Alan Menken, who obviously is an American writer, but the story is set in Canada, and it's very explicitly set in Canada, and the musical premiered in Canada. And so does this become a Canadian musical? So I think it's a tough question. But then in terms of what, do we have a distinctive voice? It's funny because my instinct answer was yes. But then I was thinking if it's almost more of a placebo. I think of, I can sort of picture in my head this sort of Canadian musical songwriting style that to me feels at least somewhat present in all of the examples I think of. But then I was thinking about Drowsy Chaperone, which I think has started to feel less and less Canadian the farther away from us it's gotten. Like, The Drowsy Chaperone was very Canadian when it premiered, but now it's almost so American, and it's sort of, I think of it just as a Broadway musical that I don't hear that songwriting style that I'm thinking of. So I was questioning if maybe it's almost more me and my concept of what a Canadian musical is that sort of hears this sound in it. But I do think that there is in a nice way, a less polished sound to a lot of Canadian musicals that comes from the fact that a lot of them haven't had 8,000 workshops with the sort of very Broadway style in mind, that they have a bit of a more less rigid flavor to them.
Right. That's a really awesome observation, and I agree with you in that way too. It's a very distinctive feature for that for sure. Mackenzie, I'm gonna come to you.
Yeah. Okay. So to the answer to the first part of your question of why have such a small selection of Canadian musicals, like why have so many of them actually broken through the Canadian border barrier and made it beyond? To be honest, I solely put it on the lack of support that is in the Canadian art system for these works. Like, our three big Ontario stage companies, Mirvish, Shaw Festival, and Stratford, like, majority of the time, if they're going to put on a musical, it's going to be an import musical from either the West End or on Broadway. Like, this year, Stratford was supposed to do Chicago and Spamalot. There you go. Like, two imports. When like, why not put on Kathy Elliott's musical that you were talking about, Graham? A beautiful Canadian story. Like,
there was an original Canadian musical happening too, though, wasn't there?
There was, at the new theater that they were building. That they were
right. Yes. Yeah. So Stratford still kind of does an original musical once in a while, but for a majority of the time, like, we don't get the bigger support that you would need. Like, say what you will about Garth Drabinsky in Live Ant. What he did financially, horrible. Totally deserved to go to jail for that. But what he did at the time was he really enforced the whole concept of doing Canadian casts. If you're going to do an import musical, like you're gonna do a Canadian cast, or he's bringing in Ragtime Parade, Kiss of the Spider Woman into Toronto to make it a much more major hub of the theater community. And when you have support from these bigger places that are putting on these shows, it gets seen by a wider audience. Like, for example, I don't know if anybody if any of us knows, the Talk is Free Theater, the big professional theater company up in Barrie, they do world premiere musicals all the time. One of the best musicals I ever saw was a musical about an autistic man on the day his mother dies, and the musical was called Playground. Made me cry. I saw it 3 times. Every time brought tears to my eyes. Beautiful story. Never been seen again. It played once, and that was it. And that's what happens. Like, Soul Pepper does that as well. These smaller regional companies are the ones that produce these shows, but then they don't get any further because there's that not driving support force. And like Come From Away, the reason why it made it across was because an American producer came in and helped push it over the line, basically, and made it and brought it. But that took a lot of time. That wasn't like came out in Strariton and then a few years later was off to Broadway. Like, that composition team really had to pound the pavement to get people to pay attention. And I think Come From Away was also helpful in its own way because it's still very much an American story about 9/11, and it's kind of like how Canadians reacted. It's not like Anne of Green Gables, which is a very Canadian through and through red and white musical. So I think that's a struggle. Like, I think in order for us to actually get up and compete, we need the homegrown support. Like we need another Garth Drabinsky in creative sense, not in a financial sense, creative sense, who's going to be pushing to really drive things forward. Like, why doesn't the Mirvish Company, they have so many theaters when the pandemic's not on, that have all these touring shows coming through? Why not commit one theater to staging for a month, for 6 weeks, a big work, a Canadian musical theater piece? Like you have the money, you can do it. Like, bring in Hamilton and all these other shows give you the money you need to support yourself. It's not like you're dying for money. I mean, tickets cost $400 a pop. Like, when we start on that's a bigger topic. But yeah, so that's that side of it. Where we need the homegrown support for us to actually make it across the line, because there's a ton of great work coming out of Canadian musical theater that has that should be seen by more. But until we get that home support, ain't gonna happen. Do Canadians have a distinct voice? I think we are starting to get a more distinct voice with the works like Kathy Elliott was doing and things like that before her untimely passing, and also Leslie Arden, things like that, where I think because we are kind of the little sibling of the West End and Broadway, a lot of writers take the sound of what else is being heard around, and then they echo chamber it out. As much as I love our musical, like Playground still had a very much classical musical theater sound. And when you're talking to an American producer who's going, do I put my money behind a show that's already in my own country, that doesn't have import fees and everything else I got to do to get it over the border? Or do I do a show that's already homegrown and is basically I just got to move it from La Jolla Playhouse in California over to Broadway? Like, obviously, as a producer, you're looking at cost. You go with your own versus going elsewhere, unless you're a really adventurous producer who's searching for a really unique piece. So that's why I think another big reason is that our voice is becoming a little bit more clear. But because we're the younger sibling to these bigger hubs, we are still working to refine what that is. And I think that goes for the same with Canadian playwriting as well. Yep. We are still refining and finding our voice because we are so influenced and kind of force-fed all this other North American hub stuff that comes through that it can be really hard to sometimes find your voice. I think we are finding it, but I think for now I say we don't have a distinct enough voice, because that's, as Emma said, a lot of the Canadian pieces that aren't set in Canada do sound very Broadway, like Drowsy Chaperone, Evil Dead, Dracula. Like, all these musicals, unless you told someone, oh, they were run by a Canadian team, you wouldn't know.
Mm-hmm.
Sad to say, but it is true. So yeah, I think that's the thing. I mean, Canadians, we're making our way, but we still got a long road ahead of us. So
Yep.
plugging everybody.
And before I toss to Graham, a U of T person as well, just to take a memory trip down memory lane on my side, University of Toronto, Sheridan. I went for theater and drama studies there, and I remember Mac learning in my Canadian theater history class the first 3 weeks of lecture. There was always a component of how that Canada is the little sibling to New York and London, very much so, and we've had Canadians throughout the time try to change that, like Massey, etc., and try to infuse Canadians' voices, pieces to be created. But yeah, with star-studded casts and stuff coming from America and coming from across the pond, it's been a bit of a deeper hole to dig out of. So very much so. And I think Canadian musicals follow the same reputation as Canadian plays do. But Gran, from a theoretical approach, as well, an academic side of things, what's your thoughts on Canadian musicals?
Well, I mean, the ones that have sort of, I guess, competed, if that's the word for it. I mean, what you have is a Canadian American story with the 9/11 musical, so you can give it a log line, the 9/11 musical. You have Drowsy Chaperone, which is a throwback musical, and you have recognizable intellectual property. One of the few pieces of internationally recognizable Canadian intellectual property with Anne of Green Gables. There aren't a lot. But there is something interesting that happens with Drowsy Chaperone that actually I feel is really Canadian about it, is that the central character in the Drowsy Chaperone is the ordinary person who is observing and commenting on the American musical. Both its positives and its warts, right? There's the really brilliant, I don't know if they still produce it this way, but in the earlier production that I saw, he leaves the record on during the intermission of the record, and Act 2 opens with an incredibly racist, orientalizing, chinoiserie kind of 1930s number while he's in the washroom. And he has to come back and sort of embarrassingly apologize for the racist history of musicals. Evil Dead is similarly, like Evil Dead is one giant, joyful trolling of musical theater. Right? That is trolling musical theater, kind of inspired a little bit by the Book of Mormon guys. By Cannibal. Yeah. It's inspired by that same group of artists had done a stage version of Cannibal the musical like the year before. And that's what led them to Evil Dead as a property to musicalize, as a fringe joke. But we also have a lot of fringe, those are all fringe musicals. They started in the fringe. In terms of why there aren't more Canadian musicals, I mean, we're a smaller population than California, spread out on a landmass that's larger than the United States, right? As a consequence, our major theater producing cities, we can't drive between them, right? If you're in the UK, you can see what's the great show being developed in Manchester, or you can even go up to Glasgow or up to Edinburgh for the festival. And the audiences can do that, and so can the producers really, really easily. Are there really American musical theater writers, or are there New York writers? Right? Like, how many of the shows that are in New York are written by New York writers or New York-based writers? How many shows does Texas develop? How many musicals come out of Texas? And there have been some.
That's Little Whorehouse.
There have been some, but they probably, I think there may be more Canadian musicals on Broadway than Texas musicals on Broadway.
Agreed.
What's happening in this country that's really exciting is the development infrastructure that never really existed is starting to kind of evolve. Musicals are just so expensive to produce because you got to have musicians and dancers, and your creative team is like 7 people. You've got to split royalties between 7 people. So Michael Healy can write The Drawer Boy, and that gets produced regionally around the States, and he's set. He's got retirement covered. But you need a Broadway hit to cover your retirement if you're a musical theater writer. So building that career is tough, right? Mm-hmm. But we've got Stafford Arima at Theatre Calgary, who is developing things like The Louder We Get, which used to be Prom Queen. You've got Lisa Rubin at the Seagull, who is a big booster of musicals, and Mitchell Marcus in Toronto with Musical Stage Company. And Mitchell's really, and Adam Brazier out at Charlottetown, who's trying to develop work, and they all talk to each other all the time. There's the people out in Vancouver at Touchstone and in other places. Like, they're actively working to develop these shows together now and move shows around the country, which is getting to be really exciting. And so that's really interesting. But like, this is a show where nothing gets produced a country where nothing gets produced twice. Like, we all lament that. So if you look at Charlottetown in the 70s, they had shows, musicals, full-scale musicals they would write at Charlottetown that would play 2 or 3 seasons. They'd sell out the Confederation Center for the Arts, which is like 1,800 seats or some ridiculous large number of seats, in a city that has like 30,000 people in it at the time. And they would sell these shows out for 2 or 3 years in a row. It wouldn't travel anywhere else in the country. They've been long since forgotten, a lot of those shows, but those are giant local hits.
Yeah.
Like, huge. Insane how successful some of those were, to the point where when they dug out Kronberg 1582, which is like the Rockabye Hamlet musical that went to Broadway and famously flopped in like 4 performances in the 70s. They dug that out, like, and they did a concert. If I remember right, they did like a concert version of it. They reorchestrated it, did a concert version one summer, 30 years after the last time it had been seen in Charlottetown, and it sold out almost instantaneously because that show still has that resonance locally. And so then they did a full production of it. Like, I think we underestimate how vibrant some of the writing has been in this country by always bouncing it off of having to show up in New York.
Right.
And I think similarly, we underestimate the writing in American musicals for the same reason.
Right.
I mean, Brantwood is legendary, the musical that they did out at the school in Oakville. It remains like legendary as a piece.
I was able to see that. It's like a fun fact.
Oh,
yeah, it was great. It was really great. You bring up something that totally makes so much sense, Graham, of like the proximity of our larger cities in the country. That's something I've never really thought about, and I think it really does hit home. And even the sort of bigger hubs in America. So, for example, like New York, or bigger hubs in the UK, for example, like London. Like there is. It's just more condensed and a lot more happening in those bigger cities, I think, too. Whereas we have things happening all in our bigger cities, like a Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto. But it's not as congested. Like it's all the cities are spread out, and then even within the city, the companies are divided or spread out too. So, I mean, hopefully in the future, again, not knowing exactly what the shape and form of musicals will take post-pandemic, but I would hope that one of the takeaways and qualities that is built is more community, and thinking about your theater neighbors, or your the different companies that are in your proximity, and how maybe we can draw together to make voices heard even more. And I think that's a wonderful cap to our episode. Just talking about proximity. I've had many Zoom conversations where this has kind of been the conclusion of, even tonight we were able to share a wonderful couple of hours talking about something we're all so passionate about, and something that is so relevant, and something that we are all missing. And we are all far apart, living and residing in different cities right now. And the fact that we can all be on this conversation together and share these thoughts and opinions I think that's the beginning of hopefully what communities and theater companies and musicals, musical writers down the line will all take to heart. So I want to thank you all so much for being here today and expressing some amazing. I have like a list of quotes that every one of us, you guys have all had like some shining moments of, oh, I'm gonna go back and write that down for sure. And I think our viewers will feel the same. So before we officially close off, we always like to leave the end of the episode. Each of us can personally plug if you folks have any COVID art projects happening or social media platforms that you would like to let viewers know about. This is the time to kind of go around and do that. So I'll kick us off. As usual, you can reach me at my artist's Instagram account, Jillian.Robinson96. Right now, I am stage managing and production managing a digital restoration series with an American company in North Carolina called Sweet Tea Shakespeare. And there are 8 restoration comedies that we are throwing in either the style of an audio drama or a table read, all done on Zoom. So stage managing on Zoom has been a whole new world and quite interesting. So that's keeping me busy until early March. So I'm grateful for that. And I'm meeting so many amazing people, and a lot of them are American too. So it's great to kind of meet fresh faces and across the border during this time. And so the next installment is The Man of Mode, which we'll be having a live Zoom performance happening on December 19th. But we just started our rehearsals for capturing the audio side of that, because it will be placed into an audio drama. So sort of like a radio play, which has been a really cool genre to step back into the 40s, etc. with radio plays. So that's what's coming up fresh for me. Emma, where can folks reach you, or what are you up to?
I am up to nothing, but but you can follow me on Instagram at Emma Lorick, Loerick. It's just my name. It's pretty boring right now because I mostly use it as like a theater going journal, and there's not much of that going on right now. But when there is theater, you can follow my theater adventures.
That's great. I'd love to just like creep your journals though for just some reading material. Graham, where can folks find you, or what do you have down the pike?
Well, I, in addition to the PhD that I am working on, I teach full-time for the Dance School of Drama and Music at Queen's University. So I'm so grateful for work right now. But teaching drama, teaching theater, discussing theater during a pandemic is sure interesting.
Yep.
You can find me on, I guess, the Instagrams at RenykG, RENYKG. I don't use it very often, but if people want to send me a message, especially about Canadian musicals, I am always overjoyed to find that out. I love hearing about what people are working on.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Christoph, how about you?
Speaking of Canadian musicals, I am currently stage managing the new production of Hansel and Gretel that Leslie Wade and Scott Christian are writing with Yellow Door Theatre Project out in Niagara. So that's going to be happening over the next 2 years on and off as they write and workshop with the kids. So that's really exciting. And that's the only thing that I'm working on right now because pandemic life, but that's okay. And I'm excited about it. I also want to just say, like, for viewers out there, if you don't know much about the Canadian music theater world, take a dive. Go and do a little bit of research. There's some incredible writers that we have homegrown here, and it's worth going and finding some of their stuff and listening and seeing outside of the big blockbusters that we know. There's some incredible stuff out there. So just take a second, and I want to just like say that so that it's said, because we have some incredible people. And then people can find me on all the socials at Christoph IB. On anywhere that you can think of, I have the same handle, and I would love to chat and discuss and just come and check me out.
Great. Thanks, Christoph. And Mackenzie, how about you?
Yeah, so you can find me at all social media platforms at Mackenzie Horner. You can also follow my podcast, Before the Downbeat, a musical podcast as well on all social media platforms. We just finished season 2, where we ended our final episode on the musical Rent. So if you do want to hear me rant about my distaste for that musical, then come on out and listen to that. Season 3 will be starting in December. We got some fun things lined up for that. So listen for that. And I also want to plug another fantastic Canadian musical theater podcast that I listen to that actually is recorded in Alberta by a gentleman by the name of Kyle. And it is a podcast called Putting It Together, where he is going through the entire Sondheim canon, song by song, and talking about each and every one of them, breaking them down. He has worked his way now through Follies, and he's still got some ways to go. So he is chronologically going through the Sondheim canon. He has taken on a 5-year, almost 10-year endeavor to get through the entire Sondheim canon. But he is working his way, and he is wonderful. So listen to that. It's called Putting It Together. And it is fantastic. But other than that, stay tuned for more great things. We have our, on Cup of Hemlock, we have our duet reviews. We have more of those coming, as well as some more theater reviews as well. And then in the new year, we have some really exciting new projects coming your way too. So keep your ears open for more fun projects on that front.
Mm-hmm. Great. And with that said, thank you so much for watching. Thank you again to our stellar panelists. And stay well, everyone. Be kind to yourselves and go musicals.
Wonderful.
And that